Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to an all-new episode of Mogu Mail, and I'm actually very excited about this episode because we're getting into Death Knights, and we finally have seen decks. If you guys are watching this right now, I'm going to be posting this tomorrow morning as I'm recording this, because I had just witnessed the first day of the Hearthstone Death Knight Showcase, and it's going to be going into day 2 now that we've had the initial rounds, and we've had a good idea of what exactly players are thinking about, or at least some of these pro players are thinking about when it comes to synergies with Death Knight. But before I continue with this, I just want to give a quick reminder to everybody that if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and hit that button. If you want to be notified about any video we come up with, go ahead and hit that bell icon as well. We've also got a Discord server that is going to be available for anything that is centered around Death Knights. I've already got about 30 people in this already. So if you guys want a Discord server that is dedicated to nothing but Death Knights, that'll be down below in the description. So let's go ahead and see how good this class actually is. And I'll go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room that was very common during this tournament that I really hope is not going to be the main way that people build Death Knight. But it's very important to point out that everybody brought Sire Denathrius and Prince Renathal. Let's go ahead and talk about this for a second, because I do believe that this is a very powerful synergy to put into your deck, being 40 HP and also having Denathrius when you play nothing but minions that die. I don't believe this is going to be the go-to for every single Sire Denathrius deck, and I think it's important to point out that these players were aware that they were going up against people that were also playing Death Knight. So once we add these other classes into the mix, I believe that the direction of Death Knight is going to have to shift ever so slightly, probably away from this and into something that could potentially be 30 cards, or just something that's a little bit more dependent on consistent card draw. However, it's also worth pointing out that everyone is going to be playing Death Knight on the first day, so maybe this is going to be somewhat indicative of what's actually going to happen, and so people that are worried about Sire Denathrius and Prince Renathal may have some actual worries. But let's go ahead and look at the style of decks that we're going to be looking at today, which is really all across the board. The only reason why I'm showing this is because I'm showing you what players are playing what runes, and unfortunately, I don't have all of the decks. I've got 3 players from Frost Rune, I've got a couple players from Unholy, and only 1 player from Blood. But regardless, all of these teams had one or 2 people go in all on the same rune, and then everybody else had to use 2 of their original rune and then interchange 1 of these in order to make their decks. So one other thing to point out is that luckily I have blue hair in order to say that I was happy about this, and here are the point systems so you guys know where these points are coming up from. But Team Frost ended up taking first place as of right now, as of day 1, and there's going to be a special challenge to where people can essentially wager points in order to get above certain thresholds. So like Team Unholy can bet 45 in the next match, that kind of stuff, essentially double jeopardy rules. But Team Frost was doing really well with Meaty, Regis, and Bunny Hopper being able to make top 4, which is extremely impressive because I was actually guessing that Frost cards were going to be the nuts. But you have Dog on top, Fino and Hunter Ace also top with Bunny Hopper at 4th. And then, unfortunately, you have Ali Straza, Tice, Disguised Toast, Aveline, Cantaloupe, and No Hands Gamer. 4 of the bottom 5 were playing Blood Runes. So what exactly is going on here? Are Blood Runes just not the archetype to go into, and Frost Runes are the archetype that everything is going to be pointing towards? Maybe that's the case. I personally thought that Frost Runes are going to be broken, and when you take a look at some of these decks that were made, I think it paints a pretty good picture. So let's go into some of these decks real quick, and then we'll go back to these images over here and kind of give my take on what exactly led to this situation. But what I believe happened, Regis Kilbin has a very good deck that is all about tempo and can also use freeze cards in order to put himself ahead. I'm going to try and not explain every single card, but I think it's really important that you guys check out the deck builder and look at all of these cards just to familiarize yourself if you're watching along to this video. I think it's going to be the best way for you to learn these cards a little bit faster, so that way when you look at these cards in the next stream, you already know what they do and you're not just waiting for their effects to happen, because I was kind of guilty of that today. But regardless, let's go ahead and take a look at this deck. So we have Bonebreaker and Cavalier, which deal damage upon impact. So I think Bonebreaker ends up dealing, after your hero attacks a minion, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So both of these cards have ways of being able to deal damage to your opponent or to minions to keep you ahead on board. One more card that I want to talk about before we really get into this is actually this card right here. Unfortunately, I can't click it, so let me scroll down here. But this legendary really took me by surprise, and I would not be surprised if this is going to be the must craft of day 1 because this card is extremely powerful. Essentially what Mana Thirst does is if you have 4 mana crystals available to you, you can get the effect of this. Even if this is your last 2 mana being spent on the card, your Mana Thirst will still pop off. So if you have 4 mana total and you play this card, the Mana Thirst goes off. But what this card does is that it adds a 5-drop, which gives you 7 armor, and then this card also gives you an 8-drop, which casts 8 split damage, and then 8 more if you cast it on turn 10. This is essentially just a mini Denathrius, and I feel like everybody's going to be running this card because it's got early tempo, it's got mid-game survivability, and then it has a late-game actual, like, threat, I guess is the best way to describe it. Almost like a mini Denathrius, a mini Cthulhu, which can set up for actual Denathrius, and I think almost every single player was running this in their deck. And I think, again, it's going to be the must-craft of the expansion when it releases. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I just really wanted to talk about this card because it's really impressive what this legendary can do. Regardless, you have Defrost, which draws cards. Same thing with Blood Mage Thalnos. You have Frost Strike in order to deal damage, and you get to discover a Frost card, if I remember correctly, if you end up killing the minion. You have Harbinger of Winter, which draws a Frost spell. You have Chillblade Baron, which also draws cards on its Death Rattle and it's on its Battle Cry. Glacial Advance and Howling Blast, if I remember correctly. Glacial Advance deals 4. The next spell you have costs 2 less. And then, where's the other one? And then Howling Blast deals 3 damage to an enemy, freeze it, and then deal 1 damage to all their minions. It can be a really good source of AoE. And that seems to be the bread and butter of these Frost decks. Lots of AoE, lots of minions to be able to generate, and then you put yourself ahead by putting your opponent behind. One thing to point out, though, Regis is not playing all 3 Frost runes, so he cannot play the AoE Frost card that's available, but you do have cards like Patchwork, and Patchwork was like the MVP in this stream, because killing Sire Denathrius pretty much put you ahead unbelievably so. Like, everyone was playing this card, so if you killed that, you got rid of lifesteal, and you got rid of damage. So Patchwork may be a legitimate card, especially since, like, if your opponent plays something on the field, and then you play Patchwork, like, you can kind of get, like, you can catch your opponent off guard, as well as killing something in deck, which is always going to be powerful, especially if you hit the Sire Denathrius. But the rest of the deck, pretty self-explanatory. You have a card that summons a lot of minions, card that deals damage when it dies, and it also has Reborn. School Teacher is an MVP in Death Knight, and I think is going to be core in almost every single Death Knight deck, both in aggro and in control decks, because there are so many good rune cards that are available, and you can find cards outside of your rune requirements. I think that is very important for these Discover cards. And another card that works really well with that is this Nerubian. If an undead minion has died, you get to discover a card for 2 mana less, and it actually stays 2 mana less until you play it, so that's automatically really good. Rime Fang Sword in order to help with discounting. Remorseless Winter, essentially Consecration with a card draw. This deck is really good because it pressures, it has ways of interacting with your opponent, essentially ways of killing the Denathrius, and it also has ways of being able to stall them, and essentially building up your own board in the process. So Regis did really well with this deck, and Meaty also did really well with his deck. So Frost cards are looking really good because they put your opponent behind, put yourself ahead, and in this particular meta of only Death Knight cards, freezing, if you get your board frozen, you're kind of screwed as a Death Knight. So multiple freezes look like it could be really meta relevant, and one thing that I'm really looking forward to is Lady Death Whisper into double Frostworm Fury, to where you can duplicate them and then have 4 of them, and if you play 4 of these back to back against any board-based deck, they are going to die. So this deck is a little bit more all in on those synergies. You have Marrow Manipulator, which deals damage based off of how many, let's see, yeah, spend up to 5 corpses, deal 2 damage to a random enemy minion for each. So it's one of your ways of being able to actually deal damage into the board and control everything that you go up against, so that way your freezes actually do matter. This deck is very similar to Regis's deck, except it's a lot more stall heavy and removal heavy. It's less about tempo and more about putting your opponent behind to put yourself ahead. And I always feel like that is one of the most powerful things you can do at Hearthstone. Meaty's also running the Queen. Queen just makes sense in a lot of Frost decks because you have this 0 mana refresh card and just a lot of cheap spells in general. So I feel like Queen is just going to kind of go hand in hand with a lot of Death Knight decks in general. But this was the best Frost deck that performed. Meaty did go 0-4 to start and then had a 7-game win streak, if I remember correctly. So this deck was failing at first, but then he started to get his footing with the deck. I think that this is probably the deck that I might try the very first day, except cut out Sire Denathrius, because I really don't want Sire Denathrius Renathal to be the norm. But again, everybody is running this for a reason, and even Bunny Hopper, who had the most interesting lists, still had Prince Renathal and Sire Denathrius in it. But let's take a quick look at this, because this is a really cool combo, or a really cool archetype that utilizes dragons. So Amalgam of the Deep is really a card that you can just use to find more undead minions, but it also counts as a dragon. So if you have cards like Amber Whelp, you have cards like Mali and Raid Boss Onyxia, so that way you can actually get value out of the Kazakhstan that's in here. And I think the reason why Kazakhstan is in here is because Bunny Hopper, I think, was the only player with the cojones to bring Bone Lord Frostwhisper. And unfortunately, the only real time we saw this card in action was because of a random card, which I'll get to here in a second. And I'm going to warn you guys, you don't want to play it. But this was definitely the most interesting deck. I really don't know what the direction of it was, but kind of like what I said, if you had a Death Knight deck that could beat the Death Knight decks, then you would just automatically win the tournament. And if Kazakhstan was a way to get a second win con in case Sire Denathrius wasn't enough, I can kind of understand his reasoning. Plus, with Malagos being able to draw half the deck, that was also really good since it has refresh mana capabilities. So this deck is just really interesting, but I would definitely craft this with caution if you're going to be doing something. And oh yeah, one more thing I want to talk about before I move on to the next rune class is Spammy Arcanist. Spammy Arcanist is perfect in Death Knight, because there are so many ways that you have like Reborn minions that can help with the next threshold very easily. You have a way of being able to summon a 1/1, which can either be your first proc or can help you trade. There are lots of ways to set up Spammy Arcanist to where I would not be surprised to see this in every single control version of the deck. So now let's go ahead and move on to the Unholy Rune cards. Unholy Rune cards were pretty much theorized to be really good at token-based strategies, and that was very apparent from today. And let's go ahead and go through some of these cards and already give you an idea of what's going on. You still have Amalgam, you still have Astrolore. I feel like this is just going to be in every single deck. Heartstrike deals damage, and if I remember correctly, it summons Rush Minion. I might be wrong on that. But Battlefield Necromancer and Necrotic Mortician. Let's just go ahead and take a look at these cards because I always get them mixed up. The Mortician, if a friendly undead minion has died this turn, you get to discover an Unholy Rune. Always good in the deck because you can find cards that are not within your class. And then you also have Battlefield Necromancer, which summons a 1/2 with Taunt as long as you have a corpse. So you can kind of just like keep feeding your Sire Denathrius with just multiple token minions, but the real point of this deck is to stick a minion and then eventually be able to either buff it with like cards like the Scourge, or I'm sorry, with cards like Invincible. The buff card I'm thinking of is actually not in this deck, but it's in the next deck. But this is just, you know, play a bunch of tokens, have them stick, use like Famished Fool in order to draw a bunch of cards. Gnome Muncher is actually pretty cool as well, since it can deal damage to the face. But this deck, I really don't know the direction of it outside the fact that it's just tokens, to where you can spend corpses, you can have a Gigantic Stitch Giant turn, that's possible, especially if you play the Lorthamar Terron, which, if you don't remember what this card does, it doubles the stats of all the cards in your deck. So this deck can do some pretty wacky things, and I do think that Invincible is a very good card that is going to see play in almost any Death Knight deck that is trying to exert pressure and potentially kill you with minion pressure. And now I have to tell you guys, the Scourge. It's a cool legendary spell that's available, but I gotta tell you, we cannot play this card. You cannot play this card, okay? And there's a reason why I'm telling you that you cannot play this card, okay? And it's because Bone Whisper, or Bone Lord. And for the rest of the game, your cards cost 0, but then you die in 3 turns. And unfortunately, this deck does not have a lot of consistent ways of being able to kill your opponent without Denathrius. So if you end up getting this card randomly from the Scourge, you're going to automatically regret it, and I can already see the trolling clips now where people end up dying, and some people ended up dying because of this today. So this isn't just me being like, oh, it could happen, so you shouldn't worry about it. No, it's already happened. It's going to happen to you. It will happen to you. Don't let yourself happen. Don't let it happen to you, man. The Scourge is... It's got the 1 low roll, but other than that, it is just build a board for 9 mana. And there's also Bone Guard Commander, which builds up an entire board of 1/2 taunts, if I remember correctly. Let me just go ahead and double check that because I do not want to lead you astray with my opinions, because I am trying to be the Death Knight guy, and unfortunately, I do not remember cards very well. But yep, this is the one that gives you a bunch of minions. Really good with Sire Denathrius. I feel like this is going to be a very common reason that people put in one Blood Rune, as well as the patchwork. Like, these cards just kind of work really well for what Death Knight wants to do. So you get what this deck is trying to do. It's tokens. It's got a lot of synergies that work with multiple minions. But what about the Frost version of the Undead? How can we kind of change this up to where we can maybe run cards that are not like Patchwork and not the other Taunt guy? So the cards that we have in this place are cards like Acolyte of Death, which draws a card for every time your Undead minion dies. You have cards like the Frost, which helps you draw. You have cards like Thracion that gives you... I'm mispronouncing cards all day today. I'm tired. Go ahead and sue me. But this card deals damage every single time it dies, and it's also got Reborn, so it works pretty well in that department. But you see like a common trend here. Like, you see the Nerubian Visor, you see the Renathal, you see School Teacher, you see Bran, obviously. And then you have Sire Denathrius, and then the typical cards you would see in Unholy would be Stitch Giant, the Scourge, Invincible, because you have plenty of cards that give you minions. Like, you're seeing a common trend here when you analyze some of these decks side by side, even when you look at some of the Frost decks. So the cards that pro players are thinking are good in Demon Hunter are actually performing somewhat decently. So what about if we look at Dog's deck? Because Dog had the most successful run out of everybody. And if we look at these back to back, there are not that many differences between Toast's deck and Dog's deck. Very, very slight changes. So what's going on here with Dog's deck? There are more 1-drops technically, more ways of generating corpses. He runs Okani instead of Thracian, which honestly I kind of agree with. But other than that, like, the core of the deck is pretty much... Oh my god, these decks are almost like identical damn near. Like, outside of like those slight like early game changes, these decks are pretty much the same. So this kind of shows the power of what this deck can do, because if you have a lot of corpses that you spend, you can play your giants as early as, I think, turn 6 is what I saw. And you can play both of them as early as turn 7. So, like, this deck can summon really big boards. You have, again, the Lorthamar, in order to make sure that you can double your stats, have a very threatening board, so you don't just, you know, just play your entire hand and hope that it sticks. But this is not a triple poison deck, or a triple unholy deck, unfortunately. I think Pheno had that, and Pheno did not have that solid of a performance as you got. I mean, he had a pretty good performance. I'm sorry, I misremembered that. But I wish I could show you that deck. I don't have it though. But let's go into the last one that's here. Blood Runes. Why did Blood Runes perform so badly? I think it's because Blood Runes are going to be good against everything that isn't Demon Hunter, or that isn't Death Knight. Death Knight, unfortunately, has like this weakness if you're playing Control, where you're not really doing anything, but you're letting your opponent build up a board against you, and sometimes you just don't have the answers. And this was Tice's version of the deck, because he wanted to run cards like Soul Stealer, which I do believe is a good card. It's essentially Twisting Nether that buffs up your corpse count, and you have 2 of them, so it makes sense to run this in a Control deck. Corpse Explosion, by far one of the best removal cards that I've ever seen, because this deck doesn't have that many ways of spending corpses, so you're pretty much going to clear whatever board is going to be presented in front of you. That card is just an automatic kill the entire board. But there's really no other reason to play the Triple Blood unless you want to play Vampiric Blood. And this card, if I remember correctly, it gives you 5 health, and then it gives you an additional 5 health if you have 3 corpses that you can spend. So it's essentially 10 life on 2 mana, and that is just, that boggles my mind. But unfortunately, it just seemed like even with like all these HP advantages, Blood Runes just don't have a solid way of killing your opponent that is not Sire Denathrius. And unfortunately, all of these other decks have ways of being able to summon big minions, summon waves and waves of minions after another, be able to stop your opponent's threats mid-game. Like, there are so many more things that these other runes are able to do against each other that it kind of makes sense that Blood Runes just didn't perform as well, because their card pool isn't good against other Death Knights from what I've seen today. Maybe the blood team will prove me wrong, and these will actually be like insanely good going into the next day. But this is just kind of the vibe that I got from seeing the blood runes, is that they were actively doing nothing but just going for Sire Denathrius. Like, if you look at this, the only cards that you can win with are Mutanus being really big. You have Bone Guard Commander to go wide, but you have no way of buffing them. You don't really have minions that stick on the field. You have a lot of removal that's available, but removal is only as good as the damage that you're dealing, unless your opponent just always, like, like throwing their pressure at you. So even if you remove board after board, you're still dying on the board all the time. So this is why I believe the blood runes just were not very good, is because they seem to be the worst archetype going into Death Knight from the small sample size so far. But I think it's very worth noting that, like, this cannot be a coincidence. No Hands Gamer is one of the best deck builders that's available out there, and I believe that he just didn't have either good luck today, or the cards just didn't hit on the mark, because unfortunately they just don't seem to work well against other Death Knights. So let's go ahead and wrap this up, because I've been talking for about 20 minutes already. What does this mean for Death Knights in general, and does this mean that we're only going to be seeing Prince Renathal and Sire Denathrius in these decks? I don't believe that's the case. We have not seen aggressive Death Knight decks yet, and they definitely will exist, because this deck can do this class can do some pretty crazy things by turn 6, turn 7. Unfortunately, this tournament just didn't really seem to incentivize people playing for aggro, or playing aggressive, because Sire Denathrius makes sense in this style of deck with all the minions you're killing. Prince Renathal makes sense because a lot of these decks need time in order to build up a board, in order to freeze, or in Blood Rune's cases, in order to do nothing. But I think that Renathal is not going to be the main thing that this deck goes for, depending on how good Renathal Denathrius builds are good against other Death Knights. I know that's very, like, I'm pretty much saying that it could happen this way or it could happen this way, but we don't know what the aggressive potential is of these decks yet, and there are a lot of people that want to get 1,000 wins as quickly as possible, so they're going to look into aggro because they want those quick Ws. So I believe if we're going to go ahead and rank the runes in order, I believe that what you saw today was pretty much my opinion on what was going to happen, except I thought that blood runes were going to be a little bit better than Unholy. So I think that Frost rune, then Unholy, followed by blood. That seems to be according to this image, seems to be what we need to expect, but things could very well change tomorrow. And again, if you guys are just watching this today, there will be a stream going on at at twitch.tv/PlayHearthstone, to where they will have the second day of this event, and you can see these cards actually in action. So I've been talking a lot, so go ahead and let me know about what you guys are experiencing with Death Knight, and of course, go ahead and subscribe and yada 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 to the channel. I'm not even going to say that because it's already the end of the video. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed Death Knights, and if you want any information about Death Knights, I'm going to be doing a lot of videos covering them and a lot of streams covering them in the future. So thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, and we'll see you for the next one.